Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I have a simple video. It is the debut of the Railroaders interview series, where I'm going to interview anyone who is affiliated with the railroad or worked for the railroad, and they're going to tell you their stories. So, sit back and relax and listen to my grandfather tell his stories about the railroad and eastern Kansas. I'm Kimney Gilliland, your South Kansas Railroad historian. I'm seated today with Stan Gilliland. Stan, tell me about yourself.
Well, number one, I'm your grandpa.
Yep, that is
Number
correct.
two, I grew up in a railroad family. My dad was the section foreman on the Santa Fe, and he had worked for the railroad for over 40 years when I came along. Uh, he was foreman for a lot of the extra gangs that built the railroad infrastructure after the main lines went through. They did sidings and yards and stock pens and everything it was necessary to do business. They built a lot of small tracks going into factories and businesses so they could deliver the freight. Anyhow, uh, when I was mostly interested in the railroads, when I was growing up in the 40s, it was a time when the railroads were in transition, and we lived on a little branch line that ran from Emporia to Chanute to Pittsburgh. And this little branch line used mostly steam engines to power their trains with. If we saw a diesel, it usually meant that it was a work train and it would be bringing in ballast or rails or something they needed to help repair the track with.
And how often did those work trains come?
Well, the work trains were usually there delivering supplies at least once a month, and if they were pretty active, maybe twice a month. And sometimes it might be fence posts and rolls of wire. Other times it might be spikes and rails. And they kept all the section gangs supplies on hand for them. And of course, the first thing my dad had to do when the work train was there and unloaded was to inventory, because the railroad kept very strict track of the supplies, and they would even write down the weight that the rails were rated, the length of the fence post or utility poles, how many rolls of fence wire and barbed wire. And of course, my dad, he knew automatically how many tie plates, spikes, whatever they needed to put things together with. So he made sure they had enough. You didn't dare run out of materials. And this was still at a time when the steam engines, of course, had to replenish their water, and most of the old depots or yards still had water towers in them, and it wasn't up to the engineer, but up to the brickman or one of the crew to pull the spout down so they could refill the reservoir. And they also had to be sure that they had a tender full of coal so they could build a nice hot fire to make steam. And we really enjoyed the old steam engines, and most of the fellows that were engineers on these branch lines were getting near retirement, and they were slowing down, and it was good work for them, and they were good to all of us kids in the neighborhood. They were always good to wave or honk at us, and a lot of times the depot agent would let us hold up the Y that passed messages back and forth. I remember in our case in Girard, Orville Garrett was the Santa Fe agent, and I think he stayed there until his retirement, and I think at that particular time they closed out Santa Fe in that area. But anyway, my dad had 30, 40 miles of track, and they maintained that just like they were keeping house. Everything had to be on time, clean, trim, no accidents. They actually won several awards for not having any accidents. And this was in an area where the track was fairly level. They had some cuts through some hills and stuff, but still ran pretty level, and they moved a lot of freight, and of course freight in those days could be anything from grain to cows to new automobiles to eggs, what have you. It was a farming community, so they had a lot of that, and of course they mined coal in that area, so quite often there would be gondola cars full of coal, and they eventually quit using that area because the coal was so high in sulfur and phosphorus that it polluted somewhat.
So, you talked about how it was very important to the community, correct?
Yes.
So, what was it like when the Santa Fe shut down that branch line?
Well, when they shut down the branch line, there was a big void that followed that, and from then on, if a dealer got new automobiles, they had to come in by truck, and if the feed company had grain coming in sacks or anything, why, they had to bring that in by truck and manhandle it. And it was also bad because when the farmers harvested, brought in their wheat, then they couldn't ship the wheat out on the railroad anymore because it wasn't there. And this was a very, very equitable, hands-on-hand thing for the businesses because they could support one another that way. And it really hurt. And I was surprised later on when Burlington Northern bought out Frisco. Why, then they accumulated Santa Fe also and combined several railroads into one, the BNSF today, and it's created a whole new concept of things where many times these smaller communities and little branch lines are serviced by short line railroads today, and they can move 100 or so cars of grain or move things in and out that they need to, but it's still not the same as it was in the late 40s and early 50s.
So, we're seated here today in Wellington, Kansas, in your business. Around what time did you move to Wellington? As Wellington is a very railroad-centered town as well.
Well, I'm 79 years old now. I've lived here for 55 years. I moved here in the summer of 1964. My wife at the time got a job teaching school that fall here in town, and she graduated from college, so it made a nice place for us. I worked at some car dealerships for a couple of years and then started my own business and have done that ever since. At that time, Wellington was a very active small town, and it's not so much so today. It's more of a bedroom community to Wichita, I would say. There's still some businesses here that are aircraft related, but not like it was in the days earlier.
So what was it like during the Rock Island Santa Fe days, before these big mergers that swept up those small lines?
Well, of course, Rock Island's another small railroad. It's one of the first ones that was involved in lots of mergers. I forgot the exact name for it, but something like the Rock Island and the Gulf. And they ran from Rock Island, Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico. But at any rate, they were another smaller line that held lots of cars to move coal, grain, and freight in, and they serviced a lot of the small towns, and they had a lot of employees, and they worked much like the Santa Fe did, and I think they were very profitable in their day and their time.
So how do you feel about Wellington's rich Santa Fe history? As a historian myself, I have seen many older pictures through the internet of a big old roundhouse here. Was that still here when you moved?
When I came here, the roundhouse was still here. They were talking about retiring it. Wellington had just lost the area as a division point. They'd moved it to Winoka, Oklahoma. But they were still utilizing the roundhouse for servicing and cleaning engines and cars, and they moved a lot of grain out of here, so at that time they papered a lot of cars. This was a heavy semi-cardboard like material that they stapled inside the cars to make sure they didn't spill any grain in transportation. And of course they put on brake shoes and worked on the steam engines and diesel engines and kept everything cleaned out and everything. And they still had some passengers coming through at that time. And not too long after I moved here, they tore down the Harvey House first, and then a couple of years later they tore down the Santa Fe main depot. The Santa Fe office building is still here in town, and today it belongs to the county, and it's used as a office extension for the courthouse, and they have some of their different divisions of the county housed there. It's a real nice building, very, very usable and serviceable. But anyhow, it was a shame because in the old days we also had Trailways bus lines that stopped here as part of Santa Fe, and we had Railway Express that was a company that was in between various brands of railroads. They were very handy to handle what we call quick or light freight. And even back then the buses handled a lot of small packages and things. So it really supported the community quite a bit.
So there's an old Santa Fe branch line just south of here, just south of Wellington. How did that affect Wellington itself?
Well, that was a line that serviced a lot of the small communities, Rome, South Haven, Caldwell, off down into Oklahoma. My understanding that it looped around and maybe even went as far as Hutchinson to be able to handle freight for small communities. Today it's part of the K&O Railroad, and I guess it's the tracks here are mainly used for storage, but it does have some small line, short line railroad benefits, and I know they still move some grain with it. They don't have to have 100 cars, but they can take and go, let's say, from Caldwell with 25 and South Haven with another 25 and somewhere else, and next thing you know they've got over 100 cars put together that can be handled by the mainline BNSF then.
So in the late Santa Fe era, how did Santa Fe's budgetal problems affect Wellington?
Well, number one, the town's population went down considerably, and of course the money that would be spent by those people just to live for groceries, housing, everyday stuff was gone. That really affected the community quite severely at the time, and then of course the people being gone, you just don't replace population overnight, and Santa Fe was a big part of the workforce for Wellington in those days, and the community had to get together and try to provide some other jobs and some other things to make up for it. And that's at a time when the aircraft industry began to pick up here locally. We're near to Wichita, which is the aircraft capital of the world, and so they began to make aircraft parts here, and that helped to fill in, but it didn't replace the complete void that the railroad left.
So speaking of that late Santa Fe era, what were these mergers like? The attempted merger with the Southern Pacific and the successful merger with the Burlington Northern?
I can't tell you exactly because I'm not privileged to all the information required, but those mergers were, kind of like most mergers, big fish eating the little fish, and I suppose that there's been overall some good come out of it, because like we don't have Amtrak here, but Amtrak does go through Kansas. This is the main line for freight that still comes through here, so they do a lot of the intermodal work where you see the containers come through here, and they go on to Chicago and are dispersed from there to all parts of the East Coast. And it looks to me like most of these containers probably come in from China and Pacific Rim companies bringing goods to America. How good the goods are or how bad we need them, I don't know, but Big fish eat the little fish.
Okay, so now going back to your old hometown, Girard, how did the Interurbans affect that? I know you've told me about the Interurbans.
Well, the Interurbans were small, self-propelled engines that could handle a few passengers and freight. And in our area, they ran from like Chanute to Fredonia to Girard and Arma to Pittsburgh, clear down to Joplin, Missouri. And they were good for moving people that needed to go to work and have a way to get to their job, and also for moving small freight, small packages and things. And if a woman wanted to go shopping in Pittsburgh and say she lived in Girard or one of the little communities, all she had to do was take a small amount of change or a token and go to the depot, or sometimes just a spot on the city street, catch the doodlebug or the urban car, ride to Pittsburgh, spend their day shopping, get back on, come home in time to prepare evening meal, and have had a good day. They were very unique. Some of these used overhead electric wires, but most of them out in the small areas had gasoline engines that powered generators to power the rail cars up and down the road, and they didn't go as fast as trains. They didn't haul as much as trains, but that's why they were called interurban. They were just a small service type facility.
So how did it benefit the community, specifically your community, Girard?
Well, like our community in Girard, many times they would bring small packages to, say, the druggist needed some medicine, and if they had it in one of the larger drugstores in Pittsburgh, they could put it on the doodlebug, and within a half an hour or so it'd be in Girard. And again, I mentioned like someone going to go shopping for part of the day, you could do that and get back home, not even have to get the car out of the garage. And the freight that they handled was usually small stuff that needed to be moved in a short amount of time. Wasn't that expense was the issue, it was a matter of the timing to keep the merchants supplied.
And these small interurbans were all mainly created because the advent of the car was still for the high class.
Yes, and these interurbans, like I say, they usually had one or two people on board, one to run the engine and one to help with the passengers and freight, and they were very personable and could take care of business and keep everything moving and going. That was their primary job, and I don't know what we would do without them. And of course, when I was a young boy, the First World War, or not the first, World War II was still on, and they were using it to move a lot of passengers back and forth because we were limited on transportation and fuel back then.
So what was it like when those interurbans shut down?
Well, I was still pretty small at that time. I know it left quite a void. It was a hardship for some people because they used them to actually ride to work in other towns and communities, and it was a hardship for the merchants because they couldn't get their packages, whatever they needed in short order. They couldn't get that. It was definitely missed by the community.
So what's your overall opinion on a lot of these shutting down railroads at the end of the era?
Well, I don't know what to think about that. Things are changing pretty fast. We've got a lot of air transportation these days, and a lot of cars where people drive themselves to work in different jobs and things. I don't know quite what to make of it. It's a change that's going to be hard to deal with.
So what was it like just at the end of the Great Railroad era, back in the 70s when...
Well, the young people at the time didn't miss it. But say today we got into some kind of a world war or a skirmish somewhere and needed to move men and equipment large quantities quickly, we're not prepared for it. We don't have the rail services to use. And at the time we didn't miss it, but you know, they always say you don't miss something till it's gone.
And, you know, if something were to happen, you know, we're not prepared as we were.
We're not as prepared, that's right.
Because if you look back, you know, World War I, World War II, even the Gulf Wars.
Yeah.
We had, even for the Gulf War, that was mainly air, so. But, especially when you look back at these larger wars, World War I, World War II, rail was still the dominant.
That's right.
We had rail lines all over this country, but now that they're gone or tore up or
whatever,
or with smaller railroads that don't have as much money to fix them, you know, if something were to happen, you know, some guy in a small community is going to have to really try to just get out to the war.
That's
or
true.
Just help the war effort.
It would. We'd be in bad shape. Let's put it that way. If something happened.
So, I thank you for talking to me today. And again, what was your name? Just
my name is Stan Gilliland. I'm 79 years old. I grew up when trains and railroads were capital.
All right, sir. I thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.